Hi, BookTube, and welcome to a nonfiction review, or as I also like to call it, the yes, thank you, I did manage to read one other book during November 2024 besides Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. I read some nonfiction. I read a book about a tiny corner of 20th century American history, a niche, if you will. If I said the name Lucille Ball, I think most people would know immediately who I was talking about. The I Love Lucy show first aired in 1951. It was rerunning all over the place. I remember when I was in my teens and 20s, and now you can still watch episodes online. That piece of television history has been well preserved. But before Lucy, there were four other women, and they were in television. They were making their mark just as distinctly, but in the early dawn of commercial programming, their shows were broadcast live, or they were just writers, not performers, getting in front of the camera. This book brings those four women out of obscurity. The book we're looking at today is When Women Invented Television by Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, published in 2021 by HarperCollins. Let's give you some context. In 1939, at the World's Fair in Flushing, New York, during the opening ceremonies, the audience got their first glimpse of a televised face as President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed them. The next day, televisions went on sale commercially. Things came to a temporary halt because television programming was banned throughout the Second World War. But when the ban was lifted in 1946, television sales began to grow rapidly, and the networks needed new material to fill their broadcasting schedules. And it had to be material that would win them the largest slice of advertising backing, and therefore they had to get the largest viewing audiences. So they looked around for creators who already had writing and performing experience, and a surprising number of these were women. Four women in particular did very well. They earned significant money, they had creative control over their material, and they had pretty good influence with the network executives. I'm going to put their names on screen. And here they are: Gertrude Berg, Hazel Scott, Erna Phillips, and Betty White. A fair number of you watching will probably recognize one of these four names. Jennifer Keishin Armstrong was the same. She knew Betty White from the Glamour Girls and also from the 1970s comedy series The Mary Tyler Moore Show. But she didn't know how far back Betty's television career went or how it started. And while discovering Betty, she discovered these three other women. And this book is a close-up look into their lives and achievements. Let's get to know the author a little better. Jennifer Keishin Armstrong is a personality without a Wikipedia page, and I'm wondering, is that going to become more and more common? I've noticed that many writers who are currently publishing, they have very scant Wikipedia articles. She does have a website, and I will link to that in my description box, but the About Me page doesn't give you a great deal more. There's a better biography on the website of the Gotham Writers Workshop, where she is on the faculty. But the best source I found was a video story that she tells about herself, and that's on the kit.com website. So all in all, I'm pretty glad Wikipedia didn't have anything, made me go looking for better sources. You won't be surprised when Armstrong admits on that video that as a child she loved libraries, that her mother would just drop her off at the nearest public library and could be confident that she would stay there all day. It's clear also that she's always been in love with television and popular culture, but it mattered to her to know the people behind the productions and as much information as she could find. She identified with women on films or in television who were portrayed playing journalists, and her father noticed this interest, and he encouraged her to get her career started as early as possible by writing letters to local papers and offering to work for them. That career focus never wavered. Armstrong majored in journalism at college, and she moved to New York aiming to find herself work with a glossy magazine. She succeeded in 2002 and spent a decade writing for Entertainment Weekly. She went on to become the author of 6 books, which look at specific television programs: Sex and the City, Mean Girls, The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Her 2016 book, Seinfeldia, looking at the American series Seinfeld, made the New York Times bestseller list and established her as a full-time writer. I was impressed by the support Armstrong credits her father for giving her. I thought I should mention this. She said that he read every one of her books, discussed them with her, attended a lot of her book events. I've heard of fathers supporting their daughters when their daughters were professional athletes, but to support a daughter in an intellectual career like journalism or writing, that seems special. He sounded like a good father. Let's talk about the structure of this book. The hardback edition of When Women Invented Television is 352 pages, but only 285 are the text. Armstrong's book has 12 chapters. Each of the first 4 gives you a background story of the 4 women: Gertrude Berg, Hazel Scott, Erna Phillips, and Betty White. Chapters 5 and 6 zoom in on how popular the shows which were made by Gertrude Berg and Hazel Scott became. Berg's was, as you can see from these photographs, a situation comedy about a working-class Jewish family called the Goldbergs. And Hazel Scott is perhaps more important because hers was the first television program hosted by a black woman. Now, this was 1949 to 1950, and unfortunately, it was the time when Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee were looking for targets. We will talk more about that later. Both Hazel Scott and Philip Loeb, who was on the cast of the Goldbergs, were named in the committee-sponsored periodical Red Channel, and they had to testify to the committee to try and clear their names. But both had to end their television careers in the United States because advertising sponsors put pressure on the networks to get rid of any performers who had been listed. And I appreciate how Jennifer Armstrong followed Hazel Scott and Philip Loeb after they lost their jobs and documented how they managed to find work and, more importantly, how they did or didn't maintain their mental health. Chapter 7, that looks at Erna Phillips and Betty White because the issues that they faced in starting their careers and maintaining them were slightly different. Then chapter 8 through 11, that just works through the years 1951 to 1955, and you get the ups and downs of all 4 women during that time. Chapter 12, it focuses on Erna Phillips only because Erna struggled longer than the others to get her television career, her television writing career, off the ground, and this is focusing on her big break in 1955 when Procter & Gamble finally agreed to sponsor her new soap opera, As the World Turns. And also there are closing off stories for Berg, Scott, and White. Now, Armstrong includes an introduction explaining how she came to find out about these 4 television pioneers, and at the back of the book there are notes with reference citations and a subject index. How did I get this book and how much did it cost? Well, I borrowed it. Yep, from my library as an ebook, and that was using the BorrowBox app. I have BorrowBox for Northamptonshire libraries and Libby for Cambridgeshire libraries. Now, of the two, I have a slight preference for BorrowBox, but I think that's just because I've used it longer, more familiar with its format. Both apps let me browse their ebook listings and create a wish list, if you like, of books that look interesting, and that's how I found When Women Invented Television. I was browsing the nonfiction titles, and of course it's the title of this book. It forces you to ask a question. When women invented television? Because you're thinking to yourself, I'm pretty sure they didn't, and so then you need an answer, don't you? The book is available from Amazon in Kindle and hardcover formats. A new hardcover in the UK will cost you £19.29, and on Amazon.com it looks like the hardcover has been marked down from $27.99 to $12.05. That's pretty good. But there are also plentiful second-hand versions that are going at lower prices. If you're looking for the Kindle version in the United States, that's on Amazon.com right now for only $2.99. So that's a pretty good price. Why did I choose to read this book? Because I thought women on television started with Lucille Ball, just like Jennifer Keishin Armstrong did. Also because I saw a black female face on the cover of the book, and that was an even bigger surprise. My impression of 1950s American television was that it was an exclusively white Anglo-Saxon Protestant space where women were not influential except as advertising targets. We affected the viewer ratings for daytime programming. This book was like a friendly nudge on the shoulder, sort of inviting me, would I like to take a closer look at some exceptions? Yeah, and I'm too curious to resist that kind of invitation. Did I encounter anything unexpected, particularly interesting? Not unexpected, really kind of like I'd forgotten. I've lived in the UK for 40 years now, and it is easy to forget because the BBC provides so much publicly funded programming. It's easy to forget that most television relies on funds from advertising, which means the shows that get money and keep getting money are the ones that focus eyes on screen while advertisements are showing. And Armstrong's book demonstrates how the fortunes of all these four women lay really in the hands of corporate wealth. And I suppose it was interesting to learn how much money Berg, Scott, White, and Phillips were able to make as women in the 1950s. And also in Phillips' case, how much of her own money she had to use to back herself by organizing casting and costumes and locations and filming the pilot episode at her own expense, because the corporations and the networks just they weren't receptive to her program ideas. Is there anything readers should be prepared for if they choose to read When Women Invented Television? Armstrong refers to her writing as novelistic nonfiction, and in an article she wrote in 2020 for the Books by Women website, she summed up her approach to writing nonfiction, and I'm quoting now. It's easy to drown in facts when you write nonfiction. The facts are paramount, but if I had to explain how my process has evolved between my first book and my sixth, I would say it's something like this. Get lots of facts, all the facts, as many as possible. Write them on index cards, put them in order, make a big outline. Write the story using the facts. Now you're at the beginning. Now you can look for yourself in those facts. Where is the juice? Where is the excitement? You're ready to make it yours. Write to that. And on the basis of that quote, I would certainly agree that Armstrong's writing feels like it is making subjective selection from a lot of information and avoiding a very fact-dense kind of prose that you would get if this was a more academic work. And in terms of looking for facts that capture interest, I would say something that Armstrong's very good at is looking for information that fills out the subjects. It presents Berg, Phillips, White, Scott in a way that makes you feel you're meeting characters from a novel. But this quote from page 586 is a really good example. But no one who knew Gertrude Berg ever knew the woman to cook. Her hired cook, Louise Capers, was the one who made the food for the Berg residents. That didn't stop Berg from agreeing to co-author a cookbook, nor did her penchant for fine dresses, furs, and pearls stop her from putting her name on a popular line of house dresses. Empire building required perpetuating illusions at times. She set off on a summer tour across the Midwest and Northeast to promote her house dress line for the full-figured woman. As her granddaughter said, she would never have worn a house dress. I mean, never. This woman had her hair done in the classic chignon style, even when she was at home with her family. Her grandchildren never saw her hair down. In fact, they never saw her bare feet either. Right. Any suggestions now for related or follow-up reading? I tell you what Armstrong's book made me want to do, and that was learn more about the House Un-American Activities Committee and McCarthyism generally. I became suspicious as I was reading about the people that ended up on the list. It seemed to me that the real agenda being pursued had less to do with anyone's political sympathies, whether they were or were not affiliated or agreed with communism. It was more about their ethnicity. Now, Charisse Burden-Stelly has published a book called Black Scare, Red Scare. That was just last November, and it looks in particular at the targeting of Black Americans. I have not yet found a title which looks more closely at the targeting of Jewish Americans, but given that the chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, Martin Dees, was quoted as saying in 1950 there were too many Jews in Hollywood, then frankly it seems to me that an anti-Semitic agenda was hardly a secret. I've included another link. There's lots of links in this review. Please go check them all out. There's a link to the New York Library archive of Philip Loeb's personal papers, which Armstrong quotes extensively when she follows up on his life after he had to leave the Goldbergs. And by the way, Hazel Scott's website, there's a link to that in my description box, and there's a page there which talks about her testimony to the committee in September 1950, and there's a link so that you can read the full testimony online. And that's another review done. My next video, I've got a lot of scrappy loose ends I need to tie up. Like, for example, I read a book. I've not told you about it. I had 7 days between reading the last book in my Read What I Own challenge and starting Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Yeah, I read a book. I think it's going to surprise you what I chose. And also, I want to talk about how I'm managing my new reading goals. I want to fit in some tag questions. And lastly, I need to show you all some gratitude. So, December is here. That can be an interesting month depending on whether or not you celebrate a holiday, but more importantly, how much of your time and energy is going to be demanded for those celebrations. If it's going to be hectic for you, please don't be hard on yourself on top of everything else. Read what you can and take care. Bye-bye.